Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Professor Chris Alden. I'm Director of LSE IDEAS, foreign policy think tank based here at the London School of Economics and Political Science. I'm here today to involve you in our third and final China Arctic panel with LSE IDEAS. In fact, China Foresight, a component project within LSE IDEAS and the University of the Arctic, Tromsø, on the role of Chinese finance and energy investments and their implication for regional governments. China's rise in its geopolitical, economic, and normative implications have increasingly been felt in the Arctic. China has described itself as a near-Arctic state, and Beijing has gradually leveled up the importance of the Arctic in its overall grand strategy. This event today focuses on Chinese globalization in the Arctic from the perspective of international political economy and norms. So we're going to look at transnational capital, financial markets, and the like, as well as an energy and infrastructure finance. Let me turn it over to our chair first to introduce Dr. Tim Reilly, who's chairman of the Arctic Advisory Group, associated with the close association with the Scott Polar Research Institute as well, and a long-standing interest in and involvement in the Arctic over time. Tim, if you would go introduce our speakers and the like. Thanks. You're muted. So.
There we go. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you first for the introduction. My name is Tim Reilly. As you heard, I have accompanied the Arctic Advisory Group, and I'm based here in Cambridge at the Scott Polar Research Institute, one of the departments of geography here. We have a large, I suppose, a very wide-ranging discussion today, and I hope that it will be of great interest to you. We're looking at, as I say, the role of China, financial and energy-wise, in the Arctic region, and inevitably, one of the reasons why you might hear a little bit about Russia, which you may not be expecting in terms of China, is that effectively Russia, being the biggest Arctic player, is essentially the sponsor of China into the Arctic. So if you want to know about Chinese interests and activities in the Arctic, one has to look through a Sino-Russian perspective, as I say, because Russia is effectively sponsoring the region. And we're also going to look at the history of this and the anthropology of this, for reasons which will become clear in terms of what is the background of the Sino-Russian relations in terms of ethics, morals, trust, and all the rest of it, which one of our speakers will cover. I think what I'll first of all do is let you know who our speakers are. We have 3 speakers today, very distinguished and all very capable in this part of the world and have a long history of involvement in it. And then we will move to the presentations themselves in an order that I'll explain in a moment. Our first speaker is Professor Rasmus Bertelsen. He's the Professor of Northern Studies and the Barents Chair in Politics at the University of the Arctic, based in Tromsø, which is very interesting and very important because now the permanent Secretariat of the Arctic Council, the forum that governs the region, is based there as well. So this is a very, very busy place. He's a Danish national. He's brought up in Iceland. He's worked academically at the around the world at Copenhagen, Reykjavik, Geneva. His PhD was from my institute, the Scott Polar Research Institute at Cambridge, and he did further postdoc up at Harvard and places like that. His main research is in transnational flows of knowledge, talent, and resources between East and West. And bearing in mind the width of the Arctic, you can see exactly what his application will be here today. He's been developing European science diplomacy strategy through a Horizon 2020 program, and he coordinates the Norwegian-Russian PhD course in Society and Advanced Technology in the Arctic. He will be talking, let me think the order now, he'll be talking in the last speaker for reasons I'll explain in a minute. Our second speaker is Professor Dame Caroline Humphrey, who was the former Professor of Collaborative Anthropology at Cambridge for very, very many years. And now she has set up the Mongolia and Inner Asian Studies Unit. So she's very well versed and has worked extensively in places like Ukraine, Russia, China, Mongolia, India, Nepal. And she will look very much at the anthropological basis of what is happening in that part of the world and how it affects China and indeed Sino-Russian relations in the Sino-Russian, in the Arctic area. But she's not coming from a geopolitical point of view. Her input is is mainly anthropological, but of huge import in terms of China's interest in the Arctic and working with Russia. And finally, we have Keun-Wook Paik, who is an independent consultant and researcher, and probably one of the world's leading authorities on Sino-Russian gas activities. He's particularly prevalent in Asia. He advises Chinese government and companies, and has been for a long while, on energy activities. He worked at Chatham House as a research associate and then a fellow on the Energy, Environment and Resources program, and has enormous experience at policy and academic level. All three of our speakers are very prolific authors, and I'm sure you'd like to follow up some of their work. It's very well known. And the reason we're going to go in the following order is on the basis of geography and history. Caroline will start looking at the Russian Far East, its relationship to the Arctic, and its relationship to, say, the Dongbei provinces of China, the northeasterly provinces of China, one of which borders the Russian Far East. And we start geographically there, looking at, as I say, what are the normative relations there between Russia and China? What are they in terms of values? What is the element of trust there, which is vital for any relationship going forward? And then we will move northward right onto the Arctic, and Ken will look at the width of the Arctic in terms of the Northern Sea route there and the exploitation of oil and gas resources there, which the Sino-Russian relationship is very deeply involved in, and how that will affect markets. So this is a geo-economic view of the Sino-Russian relationship in the Arctic and how China exerts power. And then finally, we will move to Rasmus, as I say, who will look at, he's looking specifically at Denmark's role here, and giving a broad overview of how he sees China's activities in the Arctic, and more specifically, some of the difficulties and opportunities that it presents in terms of government relations with China from those countries of the Arctic Council, and how this affects the regional pattern there of China's influence in the Arctic. Now, after each presentation, which will be 15 minutes, I will simply summarize for you very briefly what seem to be the key points. And then after all three presentations, I will do a generic summary, and then invite questions from you, so we can have a maximum time really with questions. So with no further ado, may I ask Caroline now to speak for 15 minutes on her subject. And then, as I say, I will summarize it for her, summarize it for you rather, and then no questions, but then we will move on straight away to Ken and Rasmus in that order. So with no further ado, Caroline, if you're happy, then over to you.
Good. Thank you very much, Tim. Well, I'm coming at this conversation from having just completed an international research project on the China-Russia border. And I'm going to share my screen and show you what I mean by that. You can see there, I hope, the yellow area, China, and the border I've been working on is that entire far eastern end from the border of Mongolia to the Sea of Japan. So here the two countries are right up against each other. There's no buffer, and the history of this area is that it's been a very old border, but highly disputed. There have been wars in the 1960s, and to this day it's extremely militarized, particularly on the Russian side. There's a border zone which is closed, so that people can't go into it without permission on the Russian side. And to this day, there are no bridges over the rivers that actually mark this border. So ordinary people cannot just go across, or at least they've built bridges, but they're not open. People can't go freely backwards and forwards. There's sort of evidence of suspicion, which I'll talk about later. And right now, of course, with COVID, China's entirely closed, and it has blamed Russia for COVID cases coming and creeping in over that border. So with regard to development, on the Russian side, you have a policy now Putin has announced of deliberately uneven development. And that faces a China which has a completely different policy of coherent cross-the-board development all through the population and all over the area as far as they can. So you've got advanced infrastructure and new housing on the Chinese side, and old decrepit infrastructure on the Russian side. And the Russian side, what Putin has decided to do is to develop small enclaves, which are called territories of advanced or super advanced development, which in Russian are called tor. So that's what I'll call them here. And then leave all the rest more or less to live as best it can. So these tor, they have been heavily focused on military targets, on ports and the pipelines, of course. And one of the main tors in Russia is the shipbuilding one at the Zvezda shipbuilding one in Bolshoi Kamen, which is a town just near Vladivostok. So it's on the coast there at the bottom point of that red sign you see there. This is a shipbuilding company, a shipyard. And so this place used to be decommissioning nuclear submarines, but it's now building advanced new ships in large numbers, tankers, LNG, carriers, including Arctic vessels, icebreakers, including powerful nuclear icebreakers scheduled for the future, and research vessels and so forth. And so there's a lot of international cooperation going on here with China and Japan and South Korean companies that take on commissions to build for Zvezda. But in general, here's a picture of one of these Arctic gas carriers. There are problems with these tors. One is the poor local infrastructure. So it's actually difficult to get things happening according to plan. There's a lack of suitable labor. There's a good deal of corruption. There's a huge amount of bureaucracy, and the land rights to companies operating in these tor territories are very, very difficult to negotiate. So a company like Zvezda, which will require all sorts of smaller companies to help it with its supplies, has that kind of problem going on there. I'm just going to move now to the pipeline, which is coming through the gas pipeline, and it, of course, is very strategically important for the Russia-China relationship. This is the Amur gas processing plant, where the power of Siberia gas comes down from the north of Siberia and goes straight into China. And this is kind of working well in the sense that I think oil is flowing, I mean, gas is flowing through there, but there's a lack of connect with the local economy. So they have no, you can see it's in the middle of a great forest. There isn't local labor available. They have to bring people from central Russia and even specialists from other countries. And the effect of it politically, locally, is that it leaves the local people feeling disenfranchised and cut off from Russia's advanced developments. And I think that could be politically quite significant in the long run, because it does lead to a significant amount of dissatisfaction. Now, in the very long term, I want now to move to a wider comparison of the two countries, which concerns the well-known demographic imbalance, where, of course, the Chinese population is growing. It's not quite as fast as it was, but it's still growing. And the Russian one in this area, the whole of the Far East, is declining quite markedly. What's happened here is there's a good deal of Chinese farming inside Russia. Companies go in there mostly on seasonal kind of contracts, This is soya farming by Chinese companies in the Far East. And of course, this has also increased recently because it's a kind of way that China can get soya from Russia and not from the United States. And I think in the very long term, there's an interesting relation here with the question of climate change, because right now, a lot of the Russian Far East is forested and sort of boggy and not really usable for farming. But with climate warming, increasing areas are opening up for agriculture, and they're likely to expand. So if you get a situation of food security in China, plus desiccation, overheating in China, it's kind of almost inevitable that people will sort of try to move up. There'll be a lot of pressure of Chinese population coming into these areas where there already are some Chinese companies working. And I think that that could put real pressure on the relationship between the two countries in the very long term. Another point I'd like to make is that the Russian population is very well educated, and I think by per head of population, as it were, it's more so than the Chinese one. So there are a lot of people there who are able and very active in the whole area of scientific work on the Arctic. And I've met several of them, not just looking at sort of things like the transport routes and so on, geographical issues, but for many, many different kinds of research on different aspects of the Arctic. And they're sending out research ships all the time. And so finally, I'd like to end on the question that Tim has already mentioned. Why do people in the two countries have continuing suspicions about one another, despite the, the obviously high level increased contacts and agreements between Xi and Putin? First of all, I think Russia is afraid of becoming dependent on China, being a dependent partner, and ordinary people are very, very aware of that. The notion that they must sell their oil and gas to China, and that'll be worse if there are sanctions. And therefore, in that situation, China will be able to dictate the price, and that will not be to Russia's advantage. Also, Russians are only too aware that the country needs seasonal Chinese labor to keep the Far Eastern economy going at all, especially in commercial agriculture and construction. I mean, virtually all construction is done by Chinese, and also some North Korean companies. And then, of course, there's the continued importance of Chinese consumer goods and electrical goods and certain foods, fruit and vegetables. The other point is that Russia is still highly security conscious. So what happens as a result of that is that there are bottlenecks on the border. Even at the risk of harming the local economy, it's more important for Russia to have the incredible numbers of checks and border guards and customs people checking absolutely everything. They don't want a Chinese undercover takeover. And that's one thing that irritates the Chinese, who are really quite keen on having a more open business environment with the Russians. And then lastly, China has not forgotten about the so-called unequal treaties of the 19th century, when Russia took a very, very large area of land which was claimed by China, which is now forms that whole Far Eastern area that you saw on the map. And they built the city of Vladivostok there, which means ruler of the East. For example, in Vladivostok in 2020, they had a kind of celebration of the founding of the city, and this was greatly taken exception to in China, which flood of a wave of abuse from Chinese social media users. It's not a government policy, but it sort of underlies this relationship. And then on the more practical level, I think the Chinese are suspicious. No, suspicious is the wrong word. They're sort of disappointed, really, in the efficiency of Russia, the sort of ways things work over there, which are very different from Chinese business practices. There's considerably more, I think, low-level government corruption. There's an unbelievable amount of bureaucracy and paperwork. And there's a sort of neglect of the infrastructure, which causes delays in things and a very sort of uneven way things work, and including a very uneven work ethic, which of course that goes against the Chinese general idea that the moral person should be working hard and efficiently. But it's not really a big idea in Russia. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Caroline. Exactly 15 minutes. I do appreciate your adherence to the time. As I said, I will try and do a very brief summary of those points here, adding the sort of Arctic dimension from which I come. I think the imbalances, the lack of trust, and this idea of the small enclaves are hugely important. Zvezda, for instance, is very much a Putin initiative under pressure from the Siloviki to actually develop, as I say, shipbuilding capability so that they're not dependent on so much countries like Finland or South Korea and Japan. But between the lines, what actually happens is Zvezda wins the contracts, and then Zvezda, Russia, brings in subcontractors from South Korea and Finland to do the work. So as usual, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors going on here. I think those issues around infrastructure, labor, corruption, bureaucracy, and land ownership is a massive issue. And I think your general point there of Chinese disappointment in Russian performance is absolutely right in that part of the world. Perhaps one of the reasons for that is that China, perhaps surprisingly, has had more regional autonomy, and Russia, in contrast, has insisted on trying to run the Russian Far East and the Arctic from Moscow, which geographically alone is a hideous undertaking. The lack of trust, I think, is critical, because without it, we can't actually go forward in terms of the relationship. And one of the things that Ken will talk about next is the oil and gas industry, which really is at a geoeconomic level. And one of the things that I argue in the academic sense up here in Cambridge is that one should see some of these projects not only in financial terms, but in their ability, in their very activity, as being confidence building measures with the express purpose of trying to build strategic trust between China and Russia. And finally, I would say the very important question that Caroline hit upon in terms of climate change, there are very serious reasons and legitimate reasons why China is interested in the Arctic. And one of them relates very much to Caroline's point about the opening up of agriculture. For instance, this pollution is so appalling in China that many of the rivers that feed the paddy fields are poisoned. So there's a very real need to get into the fishing grounds of the high north, of which Rasmus will know a lot more about it than I do. And secondly, fresh water from places like Greenland. So these are very real interests. So when you hear of China saying we're a near Arctic nation, do not think of it in terms of geography. Think of it in terms of virtual connectivity for these sorts of reasons. What China is saying is that we may be geographically separate from the Arctic, but in terms of the issues emanating out of the Arctic, we are virtually connected. And in terms of economics, in terms of the need for fresh water for our paddy fields, for supplementing our diet, as Caroline hinted at, in terms of agriculture, with access to fish resources, this is important. Now, all of these things, as I said, will come through the Arctic relationship with Russia as the key power. So it is a facilitator of this. So whilst things go poorly, perhaps for Russia in the Far East, it knows that when China comes to the Arctic, especially the European Arctic, then the boot is on the other foot. So we should leave it there. So thank you very much for that, Caroline. And I hope that's a few ideas from you, from Caroline, and myself putting it in an Arctic context. Ken now will take over and talk a little bit about oil and gas activities, again with Russia, for reasons I've explained why there is this relationship with China and Russia. And perhaps you'll see an illustration here of how they're building confidence between the two nations through a geoeconomic strategic industry like oil and gas and the implications that has for the development of the Pacific Arctic. So Ken, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'm very grateful for your invitation to give a talk on this matter. Sino-Russian Oil and Gas Corporation has a long history, and then they have actually achieved quite a lot in terms of oil sector cooperation. In particular, Sino this is the ESPO, is the Siberian Pacific oil line development. That didn't, I mean, that was a big achievement during last more than 10 or 15 years. And then the delivery of crude oil was quite significant. But when it comes to the gas corporation, actually, not many people paid attention because it was a talk, and then the delivery of this gas was only starting by the end of 2019 through Power of Siberia 1. But I'm going to, because of your specific asking to cover this Sino-Russian gas corporation in Arctic area, I would like to cover on this specific importance of this Sino-Russian gas corporation. But before starting that one, I would like to mention about some key figures that during the last few years, actually, there is a big change. 2020, two countries, Qatar and Australia, they were in terms of LNG producer, their figures are quite significant, 77 million ton low and high, Qatar and Australia. But at that time, basically the US LNG supply, production capacity was not that big, but now, surprisingly, they are in the leading position. Presumably, this year, US will be the biggest LNG producer, and then they are struggling to find the market, and then that may be the reason why this importance of Ukraine case is reflected in all the media, and then during February 4th, this Olympic game opening summit meeting between President Xi and then President Xi, the media was covering about this 10 billion BCM offshore gas supply through Power of Siberia. That will be connected with the Power of Siberia 1 with the Sakhalin 3. A lot of media was covering on this matter, but I was describing that one as a face-saving act because I was not expecting that 10 BCM supply announcement. Actually, I was expecting a more significant but symbolic announcement that Power of Siberia 2 through Mongolian right would have a real progress. But unfortunately, that was not mentioned. But let me return to this importance of Sino-Russian gas cooperation. I would put it this way: Novatek's performance was really impressive and then quite surprising, but it was not very well recognized until 2017 when this Yamal LNG phase 1 was successfully announced. By that time, then Western media was beginning to pay attention that this is really working. Until that preparation work is covered by media, it was questioned whether will it work or not. But now, last year there was another after this 3 trains of Yamal LNG with 16.5 million ton plus the fourth train development. But more significantly, last year this Arctic LNG to the real development. Actually, the fundraising of 11 billion euros. No, it was 9.5 billion euros, around $11 billion that was successfully completed. This delivers a very important implications towards the global LNG supply in the coming years, in particular during 2020s, when we are talking about 4 major LNG suppliers. For example, Qatar is going to be in total 126 million ton after Nord Stream expansion scheme, and then they will be the biggest, presumably one or the first or second biggest supplier, and then US, Australia also will have a definitely over 100 million ton, and then US will be of course over 100 million tons. Basically, we are talking about if Arctic LNG, not only Arctic LNG 2, but also Arctic LNG 1 and 3 are all successfully implemented, there is a good chance that Russia can be also one of the big 4 LNG suppliers. But why this is so important? Because actually this importance was reflected by CFO of Novatek, Mark Gjedssø, was telling that basically, he was repeatedly telling Novatek project did not need to advertise the price competitiveness. Basically, he was saying that we don't need marketing, meaning that Asian buyers are very conscientious about the price competitiveness. Now, on average, when oil price is not $90 or $100, but around $60, $70, consumers in Asia, Japan, Korea, China, they were normally expecting the price of $8 per MMBTU. However, those prices are relatively high compared with the not these main consumers, but other new gas LNG buyers like India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and other countries. Those countries they will not be comfortable to take $8 per MMBTU, that sort of price. Their preference is $6 per MMBTU, that price level. Now, when the oil price is hitting again, just like 10 years ago, $100 per barrel, then this oil price will, the LNG price will go up again. The question is, will they be comfortably to take this expensive LNG? I don't think so. Now, in a sense, the importance of this LNG development from Arctic LNG. Actually, this is at the point that a lot of Western countries have neglected. The beauty of this gas cooperation between China and Russia, the importance is that Yamal LNG's success, it was done based on China's financing. China was basically the lifeline provider for this Yamal LNG's successful implementation. Without their money provision around that $11 or $12 billion in 2016 spring, I have a big doubt whether that successful development of first train of Yamal LNG could have been achieved. Now, interestingly, last year when this Arctic LNG 2 financing was finalized, then the structure of this financing, actually the scale of this financing from China was significantly reduced from $11 billion to the scale was significantly reduced, actually only 2.5 billion euros. And then the main portion of 4.5 billion euros were covered by Russia's domestic financing. So this is being reflected that now Russia was forced to raise more funds based on their own financing domestically. Now, question is, when the current situation like this, this Ukraine case is causing this financial sanction against Russia, then how it will affect this LNG development cooperation between Russia and China. Now, I assume that there may not be a big influence on this big impact towards Arctic LNG 2 development, because already fundraising is done. But what impact it will be towards the Arctic LNG 1 and Arctic LNG 3. In particular, Arctic LNG 1, that is still onshore gas. So I don't, as long as the financing is available, there will be no issue whatsoever. But in the case of Arctic LNG 3, that is a different story, because it's based on shallow water based gas reserves. So there is no track record of developing that sort of a new type of Arctic shallow water development. So we have to see separately from financing issue how this new experience will affect their development. So in that aspect, now during last few days, because of this Ukraine case, German government was talking about this Nord Stream 2 will not be approved. The operation will not be approved. Then what impact it will deliver towards this Yamal and Gjedssø gas reserves that supply to European market, or will it be diverted to China? So in that aspect, this power of Siberia 2, that gas supply to northern part of China is going to be very, very important in my view, in particular if that is coming through Mongolian route. However, Russian media was talking about initially 30 BCM, but up to 50 BCM gas supply could be possible. But I have always a questioning: China will be ready to accept this large scale of trunk gas pipeline supply to northern China? It will not be easy for China to change their stance, because when China has rejected the power of Siberia 1's route, initially they have before this finalization of the route, 2002, Chinese government, NDRC, they have rejected any suggestion of a pipeline passing through Mongolian route. That was 2002 summer. So based on this Chinese government earlier decision, whether will there be a real change of this pipeline route? So I'm just touching on this LNG cooperation between Russia and China, and then the pipeline gas cooperation between China and Russia, because it's all interlinked. So how it will affect each other? But basically, if this Arctic LNG cooperation is not properly successfully implemented, then it may be a good news for other competitor supplier like Qatar, Australia, and then America. However, if this is Novatek type, this Arctic LNG 2 and 1 and 3 are successfully implemented, then it will guarantee their very successful entry to Chinese market, and then the Northern Sea route delivery will be really strengthened and then justified. But if that is not properly working, then NSR's opening will be a little bit slowing down. However, when this Nord Stream 2's delivery to German market is not allowed, then what sort of option Gazprom will have? Then they will refocusing on the gas supply through this power of Siberia to northern China via Mongolian route. So actually, this personally, I think that in the coming this decade, 2020s, in 10 years, and then the next decade, the oil and gas cooperation, together with the oil cooperation, is going to be strengthened. Even though many outsiders are saying that that will be superficial, kind of cooperation, but I don't believe that. Fundamentally is very strong, because Now Russia has enough reserves, oil and gas reserves in Arctic area, and then China has a big market. So fundamentally, it's very strong. Now the question is how this cooperation will be strengthened, and then is it going to be really continuously expanded or strengthened, or is it going to be affected by the current things? So now I'm wondering that 1 minute left. So by summarizing this gas cooperation between Russia and China, it is going to we are going to see whether this successful implementation of Arctic LNG 2 will be repeated in Arctic LNG 1 and 3. That will be one of the key issues. If that is not successful, then what will happen with the Power of Siberia 2? I will stop here. Thank you.
Indeed, Ken, that's a good romp through a very complex issue. For the benefit of those that are not particularly au fait with oil and gas, Novatek is a LNG, liquid natural gas project on the Yamal Peninsula in the Russian Arctic. Timchenko is one of the founders of it and the finances, and he's one of the 3 people that today has been put under sanctions by the US EU's program. So it's right at the heart of what we're talking about. Well, overall, the other point to make is that what's actually happening in the oil and gas industry is that the pipeline gas, which delivers a pipeline from A to B, is slowly being replaced at a generic level by liquid natural gas, which obviously has more destinations. But the implication is that this is by sea as opposed to going over land. So there are more places that you can deliver gas more quickly and by sea rather than by land. So this is a strategic move in the industry. So the relationship with Ukraine and sanctions is very important. So what, in summary, from what I understand from Ken, he's saying is that this, along with the Power of Siberia, which is a pipeline project from Siberia into northeast China, and with LNG coming from the Arctic coast, this is going to make Russia a very, very powerful player. And in fact, it will become the 4th biggest LNG player in the world. And this is critical, the other 3 being United States, Australia, and Qatar. And from what Ken was saying, what is happening is because of the power of this particular project with Novatek, with Chinese financing, Belt and Road Initiative, and international cooperation and financing, is that actually America could lose the market in Northeast Asia, where the biggest LNG market in the world exists, of Japan, South Korea, and China. Now, this is also economic and political leverage for the United States, and Russia is going to basically take that position. So it's hugely important in terms of how these countries progress. So Novatek performance is absolutely critical for the development of the Northeast Asian LNG market, which incidentally, as I said, is the biggest market in the world. Now, sanctions, one of the things that we would expect in this is that there will become Arctic sanctions coming out of Ukraine. The difficulty is that there is such international cooperation and that it's basically successful, as Ken pointed out. So there's going to be huge opposition because people are making money. They are chasing the international LNG market, the biggest in the world. They have great technology and they have Chinese financing, and Russia has unlimited gas resources. So the sanctions are going to be very, very difficult. The other aspect of this, which is important for China and Russia in the Arctic, but especially for China, is that by definition, because it's LNG, it will be transported along the Northern Sea route, which is becoming a global maritime trade route. And if China has control over that, it has another route in to the European economic bloc, which Russia will sit upon. So one of the things that are happening is Ukraine is that Europe would very much like to work in Novatek to supply the LNG market, but it must go via Russia's NSR. And Putin is therefore positioning himself in the Arctic as a kind of interlocutor between the Chinese who want to use the NSR for energy, but to trade in Europe, and for the Europeans to trade with China and also be involved in the Novatek project, which feeds the biggest gas market in the world. So there's a lot at stake here. So Belt and Road, by definition, also geopolitically means that China and Russia, by definition, are becoming sea powers in the Northern Sea route. And because they're delivering into Asia, it means that that sea power is moving around into the Western Pacific region as well, which is a heck of a containment problem, or rather a heck of a problem for the United States containment of Russia, of China, because actually now to contain China, they have to contain Russia and the Northern Sea route because they are becoming sea powers. So the leverage that Sino-Russian gas has in the Arctic has effects in Europe on countries like Germany and France who are deeply involved in oil and gas in the Arctic, and for the Chinese in terms of trade and an alternative to the Malacca Straits and Suez Canal. And as Ken says, the view is that the price at which they can do this, that they can deliver gas, makes it very difficult for Americans to enforce sanctions and the LNG market to say, well, this is all great, but frankly, we have huge energy requirements of gas in the 21st century, and Russians is by far the cheapest gas player in town, and it's being financed by China. So there we kind of summarize that talk. So thank you very much, Ken, once again for the content, and of course, keep it to the timing. And lastly, now we will come on to Rasmus for his 15 minutes, where I think many of these themes I hope that I've summarized from Caroline's talk and Ken's may appear in terms of the regional play that he sees occurring now in the European Arctic, and specifically with regard to Denmark and its relations and its responsibilities of the Faroe Islands and Greenland. So over to you, Rasmus. Thank you.
Yes, good evening, everybody. Can you see and hear me? Can you hear me?
All good, Rasmus. Carry on.
Yes, I can hear you, Rasmus.
Good. So let me share my PowerPoint. And do you see my PowerPoint in presentation mode?
Yes, yes.
Good. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak in this event here, and thanks to Chris and Krista Pursiainen, my UIT colleague, who's perhaps with us in the audience, for initiating this seminar series in the beginning. And I wanted to speak 10-15 minutes about, many people talk about the rise of China. I think that's misleading. I prefer to use the term the return of China. And then I wanted to say something about center-periphery conflicts in Arctic states and how this changes in the global economy affect these center-periphery relations in Arctic states. And the picture to the right of some advertisement posters for clothing in East Nanjing Road metro station in Shanghai, they may be puzzling for this topic, but I'll explain in a moment why I use that picture. So the reason why I use the term the return of China instead of the rise of China is that I fear that we in the West, we often have a quite short time horizon concerning what the world looks like and what the world economy looks like. And of course, we have had a couple of centuries, 2-3 centuries, which were very much dominated by the West because of imperialism, colonialism, etc. If we see the graph to the left, and there it's very important to keep in mind that the time scale is very much skewed. So you have Christ here, then you have 1900 here, and 2020 here. How to say, the first part here is of course much longer than the second part. And of course, what we do see is that India and China were very large economies for a very long time. Now, of course, at that time, the world was not globalized to the extent it is now. So the fact that if China was the largest economy in the world 500 years ago, it meant a lot less to, for example, Western Europe than the fact that China is one of the world's two largest economies today. But it is a reminder that it is perhaps not a question of the rise of China, but the return of China, and that the world may be switching back to a relative distribution of economic activity, which is, how to say, the long-term trend. And you see the graph to the right from Asian Development Bank, which is very similar. There you have all of Asia's share of global GDP and their prediction that Asia comes back to more than 50%, which is the long-term trend, by 2050. I'm born 1975, so hopefully I'll be a fit 75-year-old in 2050. I tell my students, I show this graph to my students, I ask them to think about how old they will be in 2050. They might well be at the top of their career, and they have to think about that they're going to have their career in a world where Asia will probably become 50% relatively more important. So that's the background picture for what is happening in Arctic states. And of course, it reflects very much what the two previous speakers were talking about. For example, Northeast Asia as one of the largest energy markets in the world. So how did Denmark, not the Kingdom of Denmark, but Denmark respond to these developments? From around late 2000s to very recently, Denmark responded very, very enthusiastically to the enormous economic growth in China. There you see again the picture of the two advertisement posters at East Nanjing Road metro station in Shanghai. And I think East Nanjing Road is perhaps the central metro station in Shanghai. So that's very prominent advertisement space. Many of you will recognize these brands only, and Veromoda. You may not be aware that they are brands of the Danish textile conglomerate called Bestseller, which is one of the most important Danish business activities in China. Denmark also responded to the rise of the return of China by establishing, for example, the Sino-Danish Center at the University of Chinese Academy of Sciences in the late 2000s. I was affiliated with the Innovation Management Research Group at this center for between like 2012 and 15-16. And you can see that the campus building of the Sino-Danish Center was financed by the Danish Industry Foundation, which is a private foundation by Danish industry. So you see a very, very high level of commitment of Danish industry, Danish academia, the Danish government in the return of China, which was seen as an enormous opportunity for Danish business. Well, that was Denmark, not the Kingdom of Denmark. And then we come to the Kingdom of Denmark. And when you talk about the Arctic, it's always very, very important to distinguish between Denmark and the Kingdom of Denmark. Because the Kingdom of Denmark, which is a unitary state, but with stronger and stronger federal traits, composed of Denmark, the Faroe Islands, and Greenland, as Tim mentioned. And of course, especially Greenland, they want their share of the pie. They want their share of the pie of this phenomenal growth in China. And Greenland, which is absolutely enormous, 2 million square kilometers with a population with 56,000 people, enormous infrastructure demands, and very, very strong desire to develop towards full independence from the Kingdom of Denmark. And that full independence mainly depends on economic development, where tourism and mining and fisheries are seen as the basis of an independent economy. So there we have seen some instances of there is Chinese investment in mining licenses in Greenland, including for rare earth elements. It's important to keep in mind that, to my knowledge, none of the mining projects where there is Chinese investment in the licenses are active right now. But of course, the United States basically does not tolerate Chinese activity in Greenland. Greenland was determined to expand its airport infrastructure, and that is extremely expensive in a geography like Greenland. There was great risk of participation by this Chinese construction company, China Communications Construction Company, which might have brought Chinese financing. That was basically not tolerated by the United States, which told the Danish government so, and the Danish government had to step into these projects financially, which are now done by a Danish construction company. And then, of course, one reason why, a very important reason why the United States is so sensitive concerning Chinese involvement, presence in Greenland, you see here on the left side, right side, this graph of U.S. missile defense infrastructure in Alaska and California. But you see here, right on the horizon, you see Thule Air Force Base in Greenland, which during the Cold War was an extremely important U.S. early warning radar, and today is very important for U.S. missile defense. So there you see a great tension within the Kingdom of Denmark between Denmark, which has very enthusiastically pursued all the economic opportunities that Chinese growth had to offer, and they are now being denied to Greenland. And one could also speak about 5G and Huawei in the Faroe Islands, but I'll skip that. And this is not unique for the Kingdom of Denmark. If we look at the other Nordic countries, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, you may have heard about the Huang Nubo and Chinese real estate magnate with a personal connection to Iceland, interest in Iceland. About 10 years ago, he wanted to invest in a Chinese luxury resort in a location around here. I hope you see my cursor, Northeast Iceland, Grimstad of Fjöllum. And that eventually disappeared in government red tape because nobody dared to give permission for that. But of course, in Iceland, you also have very, very strong center periphery dynamics between the southwest corner of Iceland around Reykjavik and the Keflavik airport, the old US Keflavik Air Base, where US activities there fed into a lot of economic activity, and then depopulating periphery, not least in the northeast. If we go to Sweden, that antenna in Kiruna in northern Sweden, that was an antenna from Swedish Space Corporation, which had a contract with China to provide access to that ground station. And that contract is not being renewed, but for example, space activities are very important for the Kiruna economy together with mining. And if we look at northern Norway and northern Sweden, Finland, there were great hopes for a railway here from Kirkenes down to Rovaniemi and all the way down there. That railway is not going anywhere. Finland, Norway, the European Union can't get themselves together to do it. And this is, of course, a region which is very, very thin in infrastructure. And there again, there was the question of possible Chinese involvement in this kind of infrastructure. If we look at North America, previous speakers have spoken extensively about energy and LNG and gas. Of course, Alaska is an important oil producing state in the United States by pipeline going here down south. some of you will remember the Exxon Valdez catastrophe, tanker catastrophe down here. And Alaska has had great hopes to develop its LNG sector with Japan as a customer. That never worked out. Some years ago, there were great hopes for a Chinese $43 billion investment, something like that, in Alaska LNG. I think that disappeared in Trump's trade war with China. And on the one hand, you see here to the left, you've already seen one illustration how important Alaska is for US missile defense and general power projection towards Northeast Asia. I would very much doubt that the United States would tolerate a very significant Chinese investment in Alaska. And on the other hand, I would doubt that China would trust investing heavily in Alaska and putting its energy security in the hands of the United States. So finally, just to comment on what the two previous speakers have already talked about, I, together with postdoc Maria Kopseva, we have worked on what changes in the global order means for Arctic order. And of course, we are moving from US hegemony to a Sino-American bipolarity. And as John Mersheimer explains, that the logic of bipolarity is that the superpowers each create their bounded order where they keep the other out. I think it's very clear that the United States is very heavy-handedly keeping China out of its Arctic, the Nordic Arctic, the North American Arctic. And people have talked about the Sino-American conflicts, the Russian-West conflicts. And I think the previous speakers illustrated very well how we are seeing a Sino-Russian order. It's a Chinese order with Russia as a part of that. And I would basically say that the Russian resources, the Russian Northern Sea route, is rapidly being integrated into a Chinese bounded order. So thank you very much for your attention.
Rasmus, thank you very much for that. A lot of detail there and quite a strategic presentation, which is what we really needed in terms of bringing the anthropological side of Sino-Russian relations alongside with a geo-economic project, and for you to put it in context of what this means between the superpowers involved. And bear in mind, folks, that the superpowers involved now in the Arctic, we are really talking about the former superpower Russia, the present superpower United States, and of course the future superpower China. So if you want to know why the Arctic is important, there are three really major reasons. One is the environmental and economic science and research and development for climate that is going on there because of literally the high latitude position of the Arctic. So it's vitally important for that reason, the Arctic. Secondly, for some of these geostrategic reasons we've hit upon, Ken talking about oil and gas, the strategic side in terms of defense, we still have nuclear weapons there, and of course remaining resources, both rare earths and hydrocarbons. And finally, the third part why the Arctic is so important is because of this excellent Arctic Council governance mechanism, which is the 8 Arctic countries that surround the Arctic Ocean and actually, in a sense, rule the region. It's a very, I use that term very loosely, but it seems to me that it's a very good international relations vehicle by which 3 superpowers are managing to work carefully together and considerately, and at the same time entertain countries as huge as China, as India, as observers to the Arctic Council. So in terms of, as I say, and of course the Northern Sea route is part of the strategic aspect as well, a new global transport route that may have an effect on the efficacy of the Malacca Straits channel and of course Suez. So from Rasmus's point of view, I mean, I would say that is absolutely right to take a more longer term view of what China and Russia to some extent, but China importantly is thinking about this region, and this region is very important for them. They have to have a presence in this region if they are to be a superpower. And they are looking for allies there. As I say, in my view, Russia is the sponsor of China in the Arctic, but bear in mind that sponsorship can be withdrawn. So Russia does have some leverage, which it doesn't necessarily have, as Caroline outlined, in the Sino-Russian relationship in the Russian Far East and the Dongbei region. So Russia has some leverage here because it is the power, the indispensable power in the Arctic. From the Greenland point of view, as a geostrategic point, I would imagine that it has dawned on China and Russia that if they push very much for Greenland independence, it sets a global precedent for the West, which would be very, very difficult to handle. In other words, if Greenland achieved independence with indigenous people running a nation state, then why wouldn't the Maoris consider the same in New Zealand? Why wouldn't the Aborigines consider the same in Australia? Now, 2 of those countries are already members of the Intelligence Five Eyes group. So from a Russian and Chinese point of view, to put the cat amongst the pigeons with strong advertising in New Zealand and Australia for the rights of their indigenous people. And then thirdly, we have the indigenous people of America, North American Indians saying the same thing, that if Greenland had independence as an indigenous people, why can't we? So this is just the sort of the machinations of what's going on there. But that independence is obviously an issue because it not only is one of as Danish sovereignty, but also as Rasmus covered, it has the strategic implication of what early warning systems for nuclear weapons there as well. The infrastructure is critical, as we'll see, because of the Chinese investment in Belt and Road and how it supports infrastructure. At the moment is only working, as Ken pointed out, on the Novatek LNG project, but it is already talking with Russia about infrastructure, the Northern Sea Route. Russia cannot monetize its northern Arctic territories without the efficacy of the Northern Sea Route, and it needs to have ports, navigation systems in place, ports of safe haven, all the rest of it, hospitals, and everything else that you need to run a new international maritime route. So the chances, again, of Alaska with LNG, as I say, growing, I totally agree with Rasmus, and maybe that's a theme of this evening, that sanctions now with the situation in Ukraine are such that Russia and China are quite pleased, or Russia certainly is, because although they may lose business in Gazprom in Europe, it's most likely because of poor relations between China and Australia and China and the United States that American hopes for Alaska to supply this enormous market, including China and Northeast Asian, are going south. And the obvious other contributor, and Australia being a big player, will also be pushed out. So Russia sitting on China's doorstep with the Northern Sea Route joining them, selling cheap LNG in abundance, is very, very competitive and will change the scenery around the place. So on the basis of that, I just thought I would do a sort of a quick summary of things. What we're looking therefore at is the Sino-Russian relationship in the Arctic, and China especially, is one of change that's going on. And it's coincidental with major environmental issues, which are going to be essentially politicized now, and sanctions as well as the third element. So this is an area where I've said there are now 3 former, present and future superpowers, where our nuclear weapons of those countries, well, certainly 2 of them, are mainly based, where there is environmental pressures that have an effect outside of the Arctic. What we're seeing from Rasmus is that we're not particularly well prepared psychologically or bureaucratically to deal with these changes. And to some extent, these sanctions in relation to the Ukraine going south will put pressure on places like the Arctic. One wonders sometimes why there's been a certain reluctance of Germany and France. They have been criticized for their views, perhaps not being aggressive enough with regard to Ukraine. One of the answers, in my personal opinion, is that they are heavily involved in Russian activities with gas, the opportunities for the Northern Sea Route giving them a market in Asia, and the fact that they understand, perhaps better than some in the EU and in America and in the UK, that Putin is going to be playing an interlocutor role. If you want access to the new global trade route, the NSR, then you work through me. And this partly explains some heel dragging over, say, Nord Stream 2 in the case of Germany. The third and final aspect I wanted to mention here, which hasn't been mentioned directly, but one of the objectives that I see with China and which will cause tension with Russia is Chinese view of governance of the region. One Chinese general has reportedly said that if you have control over space, in other words, technology, big data, AI, robotics, and social media via satellites based over the Arctic, And the reason it's the Arctic is it is high latitude and very suitable for the management and positioning of low orbiting satellites, which carry this sort of technology, is that the implication was that if you control the space over the Arctic, China say, then basically you control 2 oceans and 3 continents. That is, in my view, the strategic game that's going on here. So what I'm suggesting is that from what we've heard from the 3 speakers here, my view is that the Sino-Russian relationship in the Arctic is probably moving from one of a geoeconomic alliance, especially in the case of Ken's work on looking at oil and gas into such a major market, development of the NSR to support it, etc. We're moving from that, and we're beginning with Chinese interest in space and Russia's recent withdrawal from the International Space Station with the United States and joining China, and some of the technology research and development projects they have, that they're moving towards a more of an alliance, a strategic alliance. And it is in some ways, and something that Rasmus may have a view of, the Arctic in some senses is a sort of petri dish for experimenting with a possible new world order, which is based on, along Caroline's lines of more of a regional approach to the relationship, rather than a multipolar one, which they fully understand at this stage would immediately be an existential threat to the United States and would be slapped down. But if you're beginning to move regions in a regional basis, funding them through Belt and Road, the Belt and Road is considered an economic governance vehicle, for instance, by the Chinese and their view of the control of space over the Arctic for strategic and governance reasons. You begin to see the pattern that's emerging. So I thank you very much, speakers, for that. I thought I'd just ask a couple of questions. I'm not going to do all 3 because we want to hear our speakers to get as many questions in as we can. But the question I had for Caroline really is, could you think of one thing that could improve Sino-Russian relations in the Russian Far East region? One area, maybe it's an improvement in bureaucracy, maybe it's an agreement that they have a common climatic problem that they could solve, maybe in the region, maybe related to the Arctic and the activities there. Maybe it's improving trust through confidence building measures, or maybe it's addressing the issue of local benefits. And if there's one thing that you think could improve the Sino-Russian relations, that would be interesting to hear. Thank you.
It's difficult to think of one thing, really. I think one problem is that if you're looking regionally, is that the way the 2 countries govern themselves is very different. As you mentioned earlier, China has given a lot more leeway to local and sort of regional powers than Russia has. Russia's terribly, terribly centric. It all comes out of Moscow. And so it's a question of how to, it's like chalk and cheese. How do you get them to have a common interest? I'm unsure about that. And I think it might have to be some really outside thing, like issues of environment and ecology, that sort of thing, where they do, I mean, they're actually in the same sort of geographical space. So perhaps something cooperation along those lines. But one has to say they've tried it. I mean, there have been attempts, and they haven't worked out terribly well. So I'm slightly at a loss, I'm afraid to say.
Okay, well, that's fair enough. And I think, that's where we are, which perhaps reflects my overall point, that we're going through a period of change here, massive change, and things are evolving. Again, as Rasmus mentioned as well, that perhaps our framework of understanding this needs to alter, and someone like yourself as an anthropologist will be really at the forefront of that, of seeing how at a very personal, individual level that could happen. So for Ken, I wanted to know really that, how do you think perhaps the loss in the future of Gazprom pipeline gas into Europe may affect some of these Arctic projects and Sino-Russian relations in the Far East? Will it make the attempt at capturing the Northeast Asian market greater or less? How will this affect, do you think, their relationship and in both the Arctic and in the Northeast Asian LNG market?
I would respond this way. Actually, EU and Washington, they are they are dreading to hear any news that Russia to be swing supplier between European market and Asian, in particular China market. So Nord Stream 2 is a culmination of that swing supplier position in European market, and then China. That is at the right order. However, I think because of this Ukraine case, now, ironically, this development is going to push for Russia to refocus on this NSR route quite aggressively. And then if that is happening, then how it will affect this part of Siberia line connection through Mongolia to northern part of China. So I had a number of comments on this Western media, but I was always telling that the real game changer it will be how successful development it will be Gjedssø LNG development between China and Novatek, because actually Gazprom have no track record of succeeding in delivering this Arctic onshore gas-based LNG supply. Sakhalin 2 was a performance with the Shell, but we need to see what sort of a performance they can show. But Gazprom, I think they are very comfortable in demonstrating to supply the gas, a large scale of gas to northern China without any interference. So question is, what sort of a priority will be given by the Kremlin itself to this Sino-Russian gas cooperation? Is it going to be Arctic LNG? Is it going to be this part of Siberia to via Mongolian route?
Okay, all right. Well, thank you for that. I think what I'd like to do now is open the questions to the floor, and then we've got some coming in. As usual, we can't really cover them all, and I'll try and sort of spread them out. But I've got one here for Caroline, and I'll read it out. Along the border areas, you discussed there are two critical areas where the Han and Ming dynasties transplanted ethnic Han Chinese for farming, colonization, and military security. Does that mean that there are differing security issues from a Russian perspective from region to region? That was the question addressed to you, Caroline.
Well, those early, I assume you're asking about Chinese or whatever Manchu citizens from the south in the area that's now Russia. I think with regard to the present day, the issue is pretty much across the board that Russia doesn't want too many Chinese people living in Russia. It doesn't want a sort of population change, but so far the regional authorities have been very keen to accept seasonal labor, which comes over and works in Russia in the summer and then goes back and has its primary allegiance to China. There is some kind of worries about the fact that the entire thing is done through Chinese monetary means and Chinese supplies, so that it doesn't benefit the Russian economy as much as people would like it to. But I think there isn't a marked difference. I mean, there are some, you could say there are some areas like the Jewish Republic is virtually unpopulated, and so there's a greater demand for Chinese labor there than there is sort of in some other areas where there's a bigger Russian population. But the overall picture, I think, in general, is that Russia's continues to be anxious about a Chinese takeover of an area that itself is depopulating, and that's across the board, really.
Thank you for that, Caroline. I'm going to switch now to, I think, a question for you, Rasmus, if I may, and I'll read it out to you. The question is, I wonder if you could address what this all means for a country like Canada, which is a significant Arctic nation, but is nowhere near the infrastructure of Russia. What should Canada have its eye on? So I suppose the question is really, the infrastructure imbalance between the northwest route passage and the northeast route, commonly known as the Northern Sea Route? And where does Canada stand vis-a-vis this Sino-Russian relationship as part of the North American as opposed to the European Arctic?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. For time constraints, which I also went over, I didn't talk about the Canadian Arctic. Of course, the Canadian Arctic is enormous, with very little population, very little infrastructure. I'll just give one example. There was quite a lot of controversy about a Chinese mining company which was looking into buying, I think it was a gold mine or it was a gold mine license in the Canadian Arctic, if I remember right. And there was much suspicion concerning giving China access to this location, which I think had some port facility and maybe very rudimentary infrastructure on the Northern Sea Route. It reminds very much of an abandoned Danish naval base in Greenland, which the Danish government put up for sale some years ago. And a Chinese mining company wanted to buy it as a logistics spot, and the US Secretary of Defense called the Danish Minister of Defense and told that that was not acceptable, and then the Danish government needed that naval base after all. So I think we can very easily see these things also in the Canadian Arctic, and of course, of course, in the Canadian Arctic, there are enormous demands for infrastructure. There are enormous demands for reasonable travel in terms of. I just saw a story earlier today with an elderly Canadian First Nation person who was brought home to a northern community from a nursing home in the south. And bringing that elderly man, a very old man, back to this northern community cost the family 38,000 Canadian dollars.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that, Rasmus. I have another question now for Ken here. I'll read it out. For Ken, it's saying, will Chinese/Russian cooperation in the development of Arctic resources force the United States to rethink how its attitude towards the development and transportation, the means of transportation of American and Canadian Arctic oil and gas? In other words, will they try to compete with LNG, look at pipeline variations or some other means instead?
It's difficult to say whether U.S. companies and the authority are keen on reviewing their stance so far. But I would put it this way. Actually, U.S. shale gas revolution was a big game changer during last 10 or 15 years. And then they have neglected the importance of this Arctic onshore gas revolution by Novatek. Now, I think they are beginning to recognize that something big wave, kind of a big wave is coming, and then that is actually last September when this Novatek CFO Mark Gjedssø is arrested Florida was quite shocking. So not many people really paid attention. And then I was surprised that this gentleman was under house arrest. Why this is news? Because he was the driving force of this successful performance of Novatek development, the Amur LNG development. So he is at the center of this Arctic LNG development. So if this development goes ahead, 2-1-3, then it is a big kind of impact it will deliver to the global LNG market. Now, this is going to be very serious factor that will affect this U.S. LNG's supply to Asian market. So they may have to rethink of their strategy.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Ken. I think we've got time probably for 2 more questions. I'd like to address one to Caroline and then back to Rasmus on a broader question as well. And the one for you, Caroline, we've sort of gone over again, but somebody's come out from a slightly different approach. And so clearly this is something that the audience is intrigued about. And the question is this, given the local suspicion, yet high-level cooperation of Russia-China, what is the biggest pain point for local, border or co-regional governance? That's the first aspect of the question. And does this local suspicion more heavily influence the relevant dynamic here, or does the top-down Russia-China cooperation, which one is it? But it's the same, you can see we've got the same question coming, so clearly this is something that people are very interested in.
Well, I think that given that Russia and increasingly China are so metropolitanly directed, both countries, I mean, China increasingly, sort of day by day, it seems to be more kind of cohesively governmentalized. I think that the high level has to be more important because down the line, people are obeying what goes on above. And if you're a governor of some local bit of the Russian Far East and you step out of line, you lose your job pretty fast and you might be thrown in jail. So I have to say, I think it's the big picture that is the dominant one. But that doesn't mean to say that somehow, possibly in the long run, if there was, let's say in the long run, a change of government in Russia, that sort of made it more democratic or something, then the local factors might reappear as important.
Thank you for that, Caroline. And I must say, I can't help myself here, put in an aside. I remember living in Russia in the very early 90s, and during that time after the breakup of the Soviet Union, an awful lot of the governors in the Far East region, Vladivostok, were forging, understandably, relations with Japan and South Korea and all the rest of it. And there was a view in the Kremlin that this was, in other words, they were losing control, and even talk at some stage that parts of the Russian Far East could be independent of Russia. And the simple methodology for dealing with it was winter time. And I think it was Yeltsin, late days of Yeltsin, early Putin, he commanded Gazprom to turn the gas off in Vladivostok. In minus 30, 40, 50 degrees. He reminded the governors of those sort of breakaway places that if you have no gas, then you're not going to be able to run any economy, and it will be of no interest at all to Japan or South Korea when schools aren't being used, when hospitals are breaking down, when houses are freezing and factories are stopped. So there was very much, again, this top-down Moscow ruled directive coming from X thousand kilometers away from Vladivostok, and I'm not sure at the moment that very much has changed. So that's my comment, and I do remember it well.
If I could just come back on that, some of you may remember there were protests in Khabarovsk
Yes.
a year or two ago, determined weeks and weeks of people out on the streets, and thousands of them. And Khabarovsk at that time was the chief city of the Russian Far East. What Putin did was to remove the man, put him in jail, the governor that they tried to elect, and to move the center of governance from Khabarovsk to Vladivostok.
Yeah, short and decisive. The final question, I'm just going to summarize it because it's a long one, I think, for Rasmus. It's essentially going on what I was talking about, the space dynamic and independence and those aspects. And he's saying, would it not be more sensible to establish a modus vivendi with Russia with respect to East Europe for the sake of not allowing the Trojan horse of China entering the Arctic? He says that it's the control of the Arctic allows for oversight of 2 oceans and 3 continents, not to mention control of space. Is it not worth considering a fundamental strategic level change in Western relations with Russia in order to prevent China from becoming ensconced in the Arctic? I think it hit on some of the things that you were hinting about the right framework to approach this, and I was hinting at about the geostrategic purpose of China in the Arctic. But over to you, Rasmus. This will be our final question, folks.
Sure, and this is of course an incredibly important and very, very hard question.
Yeah.
And it's clear to everybody that that the relations between Russia and the United States, NATO, European Union have completely derailed. I think that a huge mistake from the Western side was that we didn't want to accommodate Russian interests. Russia has been very consistent in its opposition to NATO expansion since the 90s. We neither wanted to accommodate Russian interests, nor did we have the will or ability to force Russia to abandon those interests. So, for example, offering NATO membership to Georgia and Ukraine without material ability to impose that left both Georgia and Ukraine in the worst possible place. If I remember right, seeing the question, there is, of course, an absurd security dilemma going on, where there seems to be, on the Russian side, that if they don't win here, there will be a colored revolution in the Red Square. And the European thinking is that if we don't win, the Red Army will be on the Rhine in a week, just to come back to Cold War days. But I think, going back to one of my first slides, I mean, we are looking at the end of hegemony. And of course, the United States is expanding enormous efforts in Asia and in Europe to prolong that unipolar moment. And prolonging that unipolar moment against returning Russia, China, that is probably going to be increasingly violent and increasingly difficult. And there are no happy answers to this. But I think the reality is that we got very used to this unipolar moment in the West. It was an incredibly comfortable moment for us. You have mentioned Russian society in the 1990s. It was a horrible moment for many other people. We are coming to the end of this unipolar moment and adapting to that in a way that harms as few people and human rights, etc., as possible. That is probably the big diplomatic challenge of our time. That was not a very good answer, but
no, that's a wonderful actually answer, Rasmus, because it's frank and it's true, and it's, you know, it's, in other words, it's part of the overall theme that I'm sort of summarizing now, that we're going through a period of intense change. I think what Rasmus and I are probably very much in agreement about is that there is a failure to recognize that that is going on. That's the first problem, to recognize not necessarily that there is a problem, but that there is a change underway. So I think I'm going to draw it to a halt here. Briefly, I think what came out of Caroline's excellent talk was really this issue of whether we're working at a local level or whether we're working at a state level, i.e. Moscow or Beijing is controlling this. The lack of benefit to the Russian side is making them question whether they're just being overtaken by the Chinese. And the Chinese view is that we're investing money, time, our labor, our technology, and yet we seem to see inefficient, corrupt, bureaucratic Russian management, and we are doubtful. So the question really is, how will we restore that? And we try to talk about confidence building measures and how we'd actually make trust work. So, but the point was, it is a critical intervention by Caroline, because my view is unless you get that right at the individual human level, this will never go anywhere. Then we moved along to Ken, who was basically saying that Russian gas, LNG especially, it seems through the Novatech project that costs are such that the pricing is so attractive that the United States is going to have a very major problem in terms of moving into the Northeast Asian LNG market. And with that, that means strategically that the United States loses political leverage and economic leverage over the development of countries like China. Without gas, they can't run the factories. So the point about the Novatech project as well, and other projects, of course, is that you're having the development of the Northern Sea route, not only as a vital route for the transportation of this LNG to Europe as well as to Asia, but the fact that it means de facto that Sino-Russia become sea powers in that part of the world in a new international trade route, with the Americans haven't got their arms around. So Russia is becoming the fourth biggest LNG player in the world. And with relations so poor between the United States and 2 of the 4, i.e. Australia and United States, that means that this puts Russia in a very powerful position to dominate this region and work with China. And the final point, Rasmus came up with some very interesting points about the Danish point of view and the framework by which we begin to look at the Sino-Russian relationship and the complexity going from mundane things like how we agree fishing rights up to, you know, the Tula base in Greenland and the effects it has on the strategic aspects of NORAD and SOSAS and other things like that. And I piled in and put the pressure on with discussing Chinese aspirations in terms of the control of space-based social media and all the rest of it, and how that affects the governance of the region. And finally, to sum that up, really, I suppose on Rasmus' point is that I agree that we are coming to the end of hegemony. And I think the unipolar moment is on its way, but it's by no means there. And people should not underestimate still the power of the United States. Maybe not in absolute terms, but what matters is relative terms. So we may not be as powerful as we used to be vis-a-vis the Russia. That is the critical bit, vis-a-vis the Russia. It's still powerful enough. The question that I'm putting in as my tuppence worth at the very end is that I believe, therefore, China and Russia in the Arctic are experimenting because they know full well that to move from a unipolar world to a multipolar is a direct threat, existential threat to the United States, and they will slap it. So if they start by developing regions that they can control through space-based mechanisms, through technology, and through virtual connectivity and linkage across different parts of the world, starting in the Russian Far East and Dong Bay regions, moving north, connecting to the Arctic, then through Ken, the idea moving west into Rasmus's part of the European Arctic, you can see the development of the Eurasian Arctic. And perhaps as a framework, we should start there by saying that for a European United States point of view, we need to look at this region as the Eurasian Arctic. And the main reason we should do that is because that is how the Chinese and the Russians look at it. So I will end there. I'd like to thank the speakers who are hugely informative, and thank you so much for keeping to the time. It really does make a difference. And I'd also like to thank both the University of Tromsø and the LSE very much for the opportunity to chair this. And I thought it was very successful. I love the questions, and I think hopefully we can do this again sometime. So I'm just going to finish now by handing back to Professor Chris on behalf of LSE and UIT, who will probably have a few words to say, and we can close the session there. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you once again to the great speakers.
Thanks very much, Tim. Thank you specifically for chairing the event and carrying it through in such an orderly and animated way. The speakers have been wonderful. The topics have been addressed in a way that generates interest rather than, for further questions and further pursuit of this. We've gone from the Arctic highs to the Arctic to the particulars and personal engagements as seen through the anthropological view. It's really been really all-encompassing. So we're very pleased to have done this, to worked with you and worked with this event. Thanks to everyone again, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Please keep your sights on LSE Ideas and our colleagues at Tromsø. Thanks very much. Cheers. Bye.